Has written a number of books, which, as you saw in the introduction to her article, and is a real mover and shaker on trans issues. And I have to say, I have learned so much, including from this last reading, that Trans Visibility Day might not be a great thing. So I apologize for that, because I was saying you should celebrate this, and I realize now, maybe not. My ideas about visibility, invisibility have changed remarkably just in the last week. And this cisgender blindness that you draw attention to. So I am really delighted to introduce you to her today. So without more ado, thank you, Alexa, for coming. It's just wonderful to see you.
Thank you, Deepna, for this generous introduction. Actors, they transition from private citizens to characters when they walk through the dressing room doors onto the fabula of the stage or film set. So you might say the playmaking space is trans, it is transitional, it is transient. Characters transform from noble warriors to tyrants, or from a buffoon to an endearing ass. Shakespearean theater is trans theater in this sense, not just because of gender play. And then performance has a world-making capacity. So the thematic concerns of a place or a time are transposed to a different place and a different time. So performance transacts in somatic and cultural science. And of course, you can think of it like transaction, but you can also write it separately, as I'm doing in my new book, transacting, right? And this refers not just to the work of trans and non-binary actors, but actually my point is that when you engage in acting, when you engage in speech act, you are transacting, and transacting as one word as well in all of these cultural science. So it's by virtue of this transitional property, this trans property, that on the Shakespeare stage, an off-white plaster skull can be transformed from just a stage property, it's the material presence, to Yorick's skull, to a rhetorical device that queries the transitional nature of lived lives and dead bodies as objects. In the series that Dimta and I are editing, we're considering a book, for example, on the queerness of death. The gravedigger's speech in Hamlet can syntactically ungender and regender the dead. The question is, there's a dead body which has become an object. It's not a person anymore. But does it have a gender? Does it need to have a gender? So these are just kind of the thoughts as the appetizer for today. Actors and characters that transfigure the playing space into a discursive realm of transness and change. It is all about change. And so trans-informed narratives are transitional in this sense. They're always on their way to somewhere else, to the not yet, and yet to be. This is not to dilute transness, or to say that trans people's lived experiences are not important or not authentic, right? This is to say that we should perhaps recognize a capacious sense of transness in all of these activities, not least in performance, even if cisgender actors are engaging in it. So I use trans as a verb, like to trans everything, and to promote trans-informed interpretations of what has previously been labeled as cisgender narratives. It is important to make these distinctions and say these are works by trans actors, by trans writers, for instance. All good, but there is there's a drawback, because it'll create a bit of ghetto, the us and versus, us versus them, as if either camp has any sense of purity. So gender is not fictional, but fiction produces gender. Fiction produces a great part of gender. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because once we recognize the transitional nature of things, we realize that that transness is more pervasive than we previously thought. It permeates a lot of things. And for lack of better terms, right, I still use cis and trans because they still have work to do. But eventually, I would hope we'd be able to have a completely new theory to talk about everything. But for now, we can think with and think through the transness and use, for example, the notion of critical fabulation to fill in the gap. Critical fabulation is a positive concept of composite narratives. You access historical documents, there are narratives, and there are invariably silenced voices or missing voices. What do we do with that? Historically, those characters, for instance, or those figures, they didn't identify as trans with our modern vocab. But nonetheless, I believe we can do a kind of trans-informed reading with critical fabulation. So critical fabulation is not a negative concept associated with falsehood or like everything goes, free association. Is actually a serious historical method. We won't go into great detail about that, but I'm just kind of putting out there for as another diving board for us to think from, and why it is important to topple cis-centric interpretations, to topple those labels. When something is labeled, it is very powerful, right? It is labeled, and people would actually come in and say, and follow that label and say, no, this doesn't belong in trans studies. That's cis people's work. It's them, and there's supposed to be us. I find that increasingly problematic, and I want to change that. What is a trans-informed performance? Of course, your intuition would say it has to involve trans artists. But what makes a performance trans-informed is not it's a societal imposed or self-proclaimed labels, whether it's cis or trans or something in between. What makes something trans-informed is not the testimonial value, like how educational it is. Usually that's in reference to, have to educate people who don't know enough, who don't bother to think deeper. We need to transcend that. What makes something trans-informed is actually trans-informed interpretations that we can do of all the elements, such as stage design, cultural politics, and so on. So goes far beyond cross-dressing or clothes. Clothes, of course, do not make the man. It's the mannerism and so on. So if we interpret all work through a trans lens, then this is one step toward decolonizing testimonial transness, which has been instrumentalized for the benefit of cisgender communities in the form of kind of inspiration poem. Bell Hook's notion of oppositional gaze, which allows us to engage with works that are meant for us, that even make us uncomfortable, paint us in a bad light. But because oppositional gaze does not derive, it focuses on critical pleasure. Typically, when people engage with cinema, the pleasure is more immersive. It's all about, do I identify with this character or that character? Bell Hooks is trying to push us beyond that and say the pleasure should be derived from the critical distance, so that you dissect it, as it were. And by virtue of that, we can move beyond the scopophilic interest that has been singled out and critiqued by Laura Mulvey in her feminist film theory earlier in the 70s. So that for me is quite powerful. If we can resist complete identification with a film's discourse, we can break free from it. And so the trans lens I developed is kind of inspired by that. And transness is therefore about gender, but also more than gender. Just think about how disability theory typically analyzes, of course, works that thematize disability figures, right? But this is equally important. We should use disability theory to tackle works that explore ableism. There are no disabled characters or actors, but the film is actually about ableism. That's when disability theory becomes very useful. So the same is true with other realms. So the trans lens is not about it's not about outing historical figures or characters who are saying, I found more trans figures. We can actually use trans lens to dissect cis-centric narratives, for instance, to denaturalize originary concepts of racial and gender purity and so on. To go beyond the idea of substitution, when people use the term cross-dressing, they're thinking of some kind of substitution. You substitute the actor for the character, substitute the breeches for the femaleness underneath, and so on. So what we wanted to do is to look at epistemic invisibility and epistemic injustice, and to think also about the temporality of transness, because language and nonverbal communication can affect social actions in tacit or overt ways, and this fluctuates with time. So there are examples of utterances that will constitute specific actions like officiation, apologies, consent, greetings, and all of this. It has a temporal structure, right? It's a particular time and place. So what I want to point out is that even we use a trans lens, we are tracing various signs of transness. It can become explicit or tacit over time. And it's really context driven. So particular kind of bodies would index certain level of identitarian practices at one point in time, but even within the same work, at a later point, it'll cease to do so. It may be doing something new. And that's very important to recognize. To recognize the temporality of transness is not to deny authenticity, but rather to respect and allow people to grow, respect the artists who grow with their art, and not to make the minoritized identities the centerpiece of specific artists. Last but not least, artificial bodies. There's this debate about artifice, right? Artifice in the common discourse is related to fakeness and deceit, deception. But I'm trying to turn that around as well, to think about narratives that involve artificial virtual beings. Think about robots in sci-fi. Think about the movie Barbie by Greta Gerwig, which is centrally concerned with some plastic dolls, right? All the Barbies and Kens, they are not human, they are just plastic dolls. So they're not robots, but they are sentient plastic dolls. So it's basically a kind of Pinocchio metaphor. What does this do for us, right? If they're artificial and they're not real, and the movies always portray them with a Pinocchio archetype, they want to become real. Pinocchio wants to become a real boy. And all of these robots, they want to become real humans. You have movies like Ex Machina, for instance. There are many, many high-profile examples. It's a type of binaristic thinking. Once we understand transness, we can actually turn everything around and debunk the binaristic modes of thinking, because it assumes purity. So it's the same kind of insistence on purity that are harming trans people, that are harming racial minorities, and so on. So profound transness informs the movie Barbie. You remember her first visit to the real world, stereotypical Barbie proclaims matter-of-factly, with a straight face to male hecklers, that she has no genitals. She assumes the harassment would then stop. Instead of infantilizing euphemism, she actually uses adult language. She said, quote, I do not have a vagina, and he, Ken, does not have a penis. We have no genitals, referring to the fact that they are actually plastic dolls. Ken nervously asserts that, quote, I have all the genitals. And These comments go beyond the idea of a sexed body or a sexless body to comment on trans dysphoria and the common attacks on trans people having the wrong part, right? Or actually missing certain parts. So the film ends with Barbie's final physical transformation. She leaves behind the pastel and plastic of Barbie land for the pastels and plastic of Los Angeles. And she adopts the last name of Ruth Handler, who is the inventor of Barbie. And I suppose in becoming human, stereotypical Barbie becomes the virtual adopted daughter of Ruth. The levity of the scene helps to deconstruct body shaming, but it can also be interpreted as trans healthcare. Adding nuance to the message of becoming a real biological woman is the narrator's line that reminds us that real world is as fake and plastic as the Barbie land. So not all artificial bodies need repair, and not all robots need to become, quote, real humans. Sometimes it sucks to be a human. Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, this is the latest film version, is an anti-transformation adaptation. Pinocchio in that narrative does not actually become a real boy like his counterpart does in Carlo Collodi's novel, because he has always been real all along. And we have other example. This is a British show, and it's called Years and Years. I don't know if anyone happened to be familiar with it. And there's this episode where you have a teenager who's coming out to her parents. Interestingly, they appropriate the trans trope of coming out until a surprising twist. Right? They start with the typical coming out scene only to surprise us and present us with a different kind of transness. All of these, I think, are useful in our deliberation of where transness can take us.
That last clip from Years and Years, this idea of sort of a moving boundary between what's like what's legible to the sort of normative society and what's not. Like you see the parents are accepting of what they think is gender transition, but not of this transhumanist idea. And it's
I wonder if we should look at Kenneth Branagh's controversial As You Like It, which is some people criticize as a type of cultural appropriation, because it's invoking Japonismo. So kind of it's shot in California, but it's imagining that a story is taking place in Japan. So this is the epilogue. Each actor has a trailer. So it's a transformative and transitional space. And to deliver this epilogue here and to say, if I were a woman, that's particularly symbolic.
It's interesting in this production because of when the door slams to, you get, As You Like It, Rosalind rather than Ganymede or anything like that. So there's in spite of what ambiguity there might have been in the text, this particular production seems to reassert this.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there were any performances, or I haven't seen As We Like It, that keep the original pronouns from the 1623 folio, where instead of he takes her hand, he takes his hand, so that there's a kind of a mix. And I wonder if that happens. I mean, because that does preserve a certain ambiguity as instead of a destined identity, right? But editions never do that, I think.
Is it stage direction?
It's not in the stage direction. They changed the pronouns and they would say, oh, it was a printer's error. You really made me think hard about visibility versus invisibility, that even that is a binary. And I love that Jack Halberstam's idea of this perverse presentism, that the perversion is not in the sexual identity, but in the articulation of identities that are, as you say, labels, and then used to interrogate the past.
Just think about how odd it is. The following expression is. He's an openly cis heterosexual man. The fact that you don't have to label it this way, right? It's saying something. And why would minoritized communities keep having to continue this thing? Let's talk about the transvisibility. Transvisibility Day, Day of Visibility is created by Rachel Crandall-Crocker, and it's meant to counterbalance. So before that, we actually had Trans Day of Remembrance. It's in November, right? To honor all those victims. And so she felt that there's a need to create this, to counterbalance it. It is very important for a lot of communities. It remains important. But of course, at the same time, we know it's not always empowering all the time. That's the thing with Transness method. You begin to realize the temporality. You realize everything is context driven. If we misappropriate it, it leads to a type of membership check even by trans community itself, to say who is trans enough or trans in the right way, so that you can join the club and you can speak up, or else forever hold your peace. And that in itself is a problematic way of using the visibility. For others, the sense of safety is very important, more important than visibility. The kind of advocacy work that someone can do or is willing to do, and it has to do with positionality and privilege or lack thereof. So in As You Like It, Rosalind presents as Ganymede by ironically drawing on binarism. This is the case with 12th Night as well. The only reason why any of this would work is because they are stereotypically and recognizably masculine. And so most characters take them for granted. And that's how the story unfolds with the confusion and so on. So binary identities are protecting Cesario in 12th Night, protecting Ganymede and As You Like It, and even Celia when traveling through the woods. There are precarious moments in all of these, right? In 12th Night, Duke Orsino singles out a lot of Cesario's delicate features. And in some performances, it's staged as a kind of close call moment. And in As You Like It, Ganymede is almost clogged. For example, when Ganymede faints at the sight of bloodstained napkin, he assumes it to be evidence of Orlando's demise, got eaten by a lion. Celia swoops in to rescue, trying to avoid misgendering what that naming Ganymede, and just saying, the line lacking a man's heart, I think, should be unpacked. It's very interesting. Ganymede's fainting. Celia is trying to explain away Ganymede's fainting by saying that many will soon when they do look on blood, for example. So gender in this instance, it's really here they're trying to suppress any possibility of visibility, right? So that they can continue their journey. But also gender here goes far beyond clothing. Clothes does not make the man, but it's rather behavioral patterns and mannerism. In Trevor Nunn, the British director Trevor Nunn's 12th Night, the film version, you have a fencing scene where Cesario is visibly uncomfortable, not because of his gender, but because it's a lack of gentleman's education. So not versed in fencing, that is the source of the problem. Speaking of close calls, so the Taiwanese film, As We Like It, it came out in 2021, so it's shot during the pandemic. It's reimagined that the Forest of Arden is an internet-free district in contemporary Taipei in Taiwan. And without internet, there is isolation and that kind of the the connection we take for granted with people will be taken away. So it's a parallel to Shakespeare's imagination of Arden. There is a scene where we have, so instead of Ganymede, he adopts the name Roosevelt. So this is Rosalind being Roosevelt, is being followed by Orlando, who just takes great interest in them. And we are not sure at this point what kind of connection they have. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe labels don't matter. They seem to be suggesting both queer and potentially heterosexual relationship. They go into the one social space where things are awkward, not just for trans and non-binary people. It's the men's room. So this is extra textual material, not in Shakespeare. So Roosevelt, Rosalind as Roosevelt, followed by Orlando. The film boasts an all-female cast, including 2 actors who identify as trans off screen. They actually draw the dots of the bodily fluid going into the urinal as perhaps a way of kind of marking all the binary assumptions.
I guess that scene in particular made me think about, you know, one of the sort of concerns that it seems like it's talked about in relation to trans studies in the early modern period is that sort of like the question of like an ahistorical application of a contemporary trans identity onto people of the early modern period. And thinking about that scene, like this sort of bathroom encounter is very much something that's foregrounded in contemporary discussions of, or like contemporary maybe imaginations of transness.
It's a great question. Trans studies and queer studies, they have a history problem in the sense that in the field there's an overemphasis on contemporary material and analysis, giving the false impression that this is a fad, a lifestyle, a choice, and it's strictly a contemporary phenomenon. They are not wrong. And so a lot of scholars have done more digging. In 18th century, they're masculine wives, they have feminine men, and so on, and all of these, not quite using the concept of modern transness, but to signal the historical richness of different genders. So that's one approach. Say the longer we can prove that there's this history, the better it will be for the minority community to say they've always existed. There is political value to that. It's not a modern invention. That has happened with queer studies, going all the way back to ancient Greece. On the other hand, it does have a history problem, but the problem doesn't lie in historicity. Especially in my view, I feel that what is truly missing is, so there are scholars, some of those you read earlier, Kobe Gordon, you watched the YouTube video, who are saying our job is not to diagnose historical figures or fictional characters with transness, and so in saying so and so may or may not be trans. I partially agree with that. I think there's value to that, but we need to do more. We need to, without diagnosis, but use my trans lens to interpret all types of narratives. That is the historical problem of the field. Not necessarily that, you know, we're going to go way back, we're going to dig all this up and say right there, you see, these are trans individuals hiding in plain sight. There's some value to that kind of enterprise, but more importantly, we should be able to say transness is pervasive, has always existed. It's not about, it's actually far beyond identifying trans. If Sawyer Kemp and Kobe Gordon are pushing for the notion that that trans practices are not about the clothes, right? People kind of got caught up by the idea of boy actors were cross-dressing and stop there. And just thinking, wow, put on, is it a question of the breeches or not? So they're partially right. It's kind of a narrow imagination, but we need to do more than that. In my operation, transness doesn't come from only from characters, from people who quote identify as trans. That is actually beside the point. In all of the practices, from trans ecology to the transhumanism that we just looked at, and Dimna and my ambition, right, in curating this series is truly to go beyond that. And Dimna has a special interest in transubstantiation, for example. So there are just so many possibilities, so rich that has been missed. That is the truly historical problem, because people are not used to, once something is labeled, it has a very powerful effect. People say, no, you can't use this other approach to read it because we agreed on that label. So that's what I want to break down. And therefore, there is ahistoricity or applying a modern concept to historical material is not the problem. I also acknowledge that we are, I don't have any fantasy. I acknowledge we are trapped in our own historical moment. So to go around and pretend that you have neutrality, I'm going to just tell history as it was, it's just such a fantasy, as if you don't bring any particular perspective and horizon of expectation or bias. In this case could be both positive and negative. We all have biases in interpretations, and I want to acknowledge it is just part of the operation. It's unavoidable.
That's why I like how attentive you are to performance in what we read for this week. Because yeah, there is that like historical imperative to like analyze transness in the past to debunk the myth that it's like a modern sort of fad. But I think when you turn to performance, it gives so much permission to do different things. Because aside from like a very few like theater archaeology performances where you're trying to like do it exactly like it would have been, which is always impossible anyway, sort of viewing performance as such a contemporary practice gives you permission to do things like cut lines. Like there's that one line in Twelfth Night that I wish weren't in there, where Cesario Viola is like talking about disguise. They see the art of weakness, and that to me like makes it way more difficult to that's like an explicit calling out and viewing being Cesario as negative in the play. And I always think like it would be much better if you could just cut that line, because people do it all the time.
Wickedness.
That art of wickedness. Yeah, that's it, not weakness. Thank you. Yeah, like I don't think I've ever seen. People are very allergic to that, I feel. Like I've never seen like an unabridged version of Hamlet live, right? People are they don't want to sit through 3 hours of Hamlet, so they'll cut that down, no problem. But as soon as it comes to something like this in Twelfth Night, all of a sudden these sort of historicist objections get raised, which are kind of, very flimsy in my opinion. But I like what performance does in these works, yeah.
I loved this essay. I found it really challenging in so many ways, and I think we have been trying all semester to negotiate the distinction between the past and the present. Reading As You Like It, after having read what we've read this semester and reading your work, it's a different play almost. I mean, I'm not stuck in Ganymede any longer, and the insistence on the homoerotic. It seems to me that the heteroerotic can be borrowed by people who inhabit male bodies, and that's a transness that perhaps wasn't visible to me until I read the article, and just the dangers of visibility, obviously for certain kinds of people. I think that's really important, but this this question of, I mean, these clips you gave us really did bring very vividly the present to, texts of the past. And I think maybe, to follow up on what Nathan says, performance more than anything allows this interrogation, and it allows as you like it. It allows a kind of freedom of interpretation. And it seems to me that the play is about erotic freedom. And I think the play brings that political freedom and restriction together with, and class restriction together with the whole transness of the play. But it seems to me that the idea of transness, as you articulate it, and also I've been reading your book on East Asian Shakespeare, that there's a kind of malleability to the text and you've kind of freed me from having to determine the identities of these characters, their sexual identities, their erotic propensities. It's kind of opened up in different ways, and I struggle to articulate quite how that is. And I don't really want to just talk about, Roa talks about, you mentioned Roa, about contingency, fortune as opposed to nature, and contingency or ambiguity. And I think that transness really gets us out of that linguistic bind to talk about indeterminate in performance as a pleasure. And you know what, I was also thinking, reading this was joy, that you can read these texts with joy about this and not have to jump to a conclusion about, is that coherent what I just said? About, so I feel in many ways by that article, which I think is reigniting the pleasure that I used to have in As You Like It as a young person. I remember feeling just totally the joy of theatre. And then I went to about 1,000 productions of it, and that kind of killed it. And my husband, pardon my French, if anybody objects, I won't say it, but my husband refers to As You Like It as you effing like it.
The other thing you said, indeterminate state as potential trans joy. That is so well said, because I think Measure for Measure and 12th Night, they do not have a traditional conclusion. They don't give you a sense. And modern directors and audiences, they don't like this. It's very difficult to swallow. We have to have closure. We need conclusion. And so if you look at most 12th Night performances, the films, there's this joyful dance, Viola in her fully made weeds and so on. That's actually extra textual material, showing the wedding scene or dance or celebration. 12th Night actually concludes with this very melancholic song. What do we make of that, right? So indeterminate state, and then Rosalind's dread of visibility. And this, As You Like It, it's a film shot in Death Valley, and it's all male cast. So this is Rosalind and Celia discussing their plan to present themselves differently before they go on the journey. Another possible reading is the practice of so-called backpassing. This is not a term universally accepted. Some people in the trans community use the word backpassing to refer to the act of trying to pass as an earlier gender, usually in the face of danger and other threats. So it's a temporary practice. It's a survival tactic. Could that be what is happening with Shakespeare's Rosalind? And this whole thing, the dialogue, it bears truly symbolic significance once we dissect it with trans lens, to think about how it can be understood as trans adjacent knowledge.
There's a trend in fan works where fans will reinterpret characters that were canonically cisgender in the media that the character originated from. They'll reinterpret them as being trans for like a multitude of reasons. Off the top of my head, Harry Potter is one example because it's like a way to resist J.K. Rowling's horrific beliefs. But just broadly speaking, would you consider the fan practice of taking a character who is canonically presented as identifying in a certain way and either going oh, well, let's examine what if they were a different identity, or perhaps in some cases focusing on like subtextual implications that open the door for reinterpreting how they present. Would you consider that kind of equivalent to using a trans lens to examine implicit transness like we would in academic criticism?
I really, really love this. And I think it's necessary, it is empowering in the fandom to reinterpret characters. Some people say it is depressing. It is because there are not enough XYZ out there, so people come in and do this close reading of obscure moments, a bit of wish fulfillment, perhaps, and thinking that must be it. I see traces of something that resonate with me. I fully support this, and I think it is powerful. It is parallel to my proposal of using translens to launch trans-informed interpretations and so on. You mentioned fan studies. You probably know Gwen Stacy in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and right. So her non-binary representation and all of these scenes, a lot of fans are proposing Gwen Stacy must be a trans character. If you think about Shakespearean plays, why do we not see in the play script the name Ganymede? Instead, it's just Rosalind throughout. So if you stick only to the text, you have this impression that it is, and it has to be, she is still Rosalind. We can't forget about that. It makes dramaturgical difference if you forget about that, if you follow the play 12th Night, if throughout, because who do you have throughout 12th Night? It's just Cesario, truly. After Act 1, Scene 2, there's really no Viola per se. So thank you for this question. It's a very popular phenomenon. I've been following it and thinking a lot about this. There's also the phenomenon of fan fiction, right? They write extension of it, direct prequel and sequel, and enlarge and amplify certain aspects of the story of their beloved characters.
I'm Alex. I am interested in your thoughts on the marriage scene, not the like real one, but the one where Ganymede is posing as Rosalind, but that's also Ganymede. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then basically kind of fake marries. And it's really interesting to me because it reads to me as a queer marriage, but although not like legally binding.
Right, this lesson in heterosexual courtship, but it's rehearsed in a queer space. Allow the characters to relate to each other on more an equal footing. You think about it, it's actually ironic, right? In what is labeled a cis heterosexual narrative, the characters get to equal footing only in a queer space. The As We Like It from Taiwan, the one I mentioned. So instead of Ganymede, we have Roosevelt. So this Roosevelt pretends to be a palmist, a specialist who can tell fortune by looking at your palm. And the lovelorn Orlando eventually found this parlor. The coaching takes the form of fortune telling. It follows conventions and tropes only to topple them, but the codes are really important. They're coded in particular ways, right? Traditional interpretation would say Rosalind, who's known as Rose in this one, Rosalind has the upper hand, is able to frankly speak her mind, and finally, eventually gets what she wants, because Orlando does evolve, right, improve thanks to those lessons. A trans interpretation would be looking at the artifice of this kind of things, what it's exposing through metatheatricality, the emptiness of court conventions, because it can be emptied out because it's just a combination of these coded behaviors. And if you engage in 9 out of 10, you get close. And there's always a reward in the end. The reward is advertised as a kind of stability, right? Marriage. It's a structure to create stability so that people are fused together, it is transactional, and it's a type of trans acting.
That's brilliant. I mean, just amazing as well.